Dr. Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Immanuel Kant, episode 6 of reading through the rather lengthy Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophers. And we've just waded through fallout of Kant, really considering what Newton and physics meant and the Enlightenment meant, and whether you go down the experimental road or the rationalist road. And rationalism really, I suppose, would correspond nowadays to theoretical physics. So you've got theoretical and experimental physics. So it's actually shown as a duality of scientific methods and approaches. But coming through it, he had something called Transcendental Idealism. This is trying to actually work what's the difference between actually a physical thing, which we now say calls a wave function of object, and your various psychological perception of it, and what that all meant with respect to God. And so he came up with, are they two different objects, or people reviewing it then sorted themselves out into different camps? Are there physically two different objects, or are there classes of aspects of the object, or is it some other things? So this is Transcendental Idealism. Now we've got something called Transcendental Deduction. So deduction is the process of using information to get more information. So this should be interesting to read, and hopefully we won't get some very long sentences again. So, reading 4, the Transcendental Deduction. The Transcendental Deduction is a central argument in the critique of pure reason, and one of the most complex and difficult texts in the history of philosophy. Oh my God, given its complexity, there is naturally many different ways of interpreting the deduction. This brief overview provides one perspective on some of its main ideas. Okay, look, like an impossible problem leads to an impossible complexity of thought, and you can get there at certain points. And I think the overall complexity meant that people were absolutely dumbfounded, and we had a whole lot of science done by people who thought they were looking at Kant and wound up looking at some scientific things without pre things. They were looking at magnets and saying, I hope I can find God this way. It's pretty amazing type of stuff. The Transcendental Deduction occurs in part of the critique called the Analytic of Concepts, which deals with the a priori concepts that, on Kant's view, our understanding uses to construct experience together with the a priori forms of our sensible intuition, space and time, which he discussed in the Transcendental Aesthetic. Kant calls these a priori concepts categories, and he argues elsewhere, in brackets, in the so-called metaphysical deduction, that, close brackets, that they include such concepts as substance and cause, which is going back to the Aristotelian view. Okay. So you've got cause and form and substance, all from the ancient Greeks. The goal of transcendental deduction is to show that we have a priori concepts or categories that are objectively valid or apply necessarily to all objects in the world that we experience. To show this, Kant argues that the categories are necessary conditions of experience, or that we could not have experience without the categories. In Kant's words, are you ready for it? I'm going to put on a German accent for this. Not even a vaguely German accent, but I'll put on a slightly different voice. The objective validity of the categories as the a priori concepts rests on the fact that through them alone in experience possible, as far as the form of thinking is concerned, for they are related necessarily to a priori to objects of experience, since only by means of them can any object of experience be thought at all. I sort of get that, but you have to really think about it. Reading it would just send your mind crazy. Careful your brain doesn't explode for the next one. The transcendental deduction of all the a priori concepts, therefore, has a principle toward which the entire investigation must be directed, namely this: that they must be recognized as a priori conditions of the possibility of experiences, whereof intuition is encountered in them, or of the thinking. Concepts that supply objective ground for the possibility of experience are necessarily just for that reason. The strategy Kant employs to argue that the categories of the conditions of the experience is the main source of both obscurity and the ingenuity of transcendental deduction. His strategy is to argue that categories are necessarily specifically for self-consciousness, for which Kant often uses the Leibnizian term apperception, A-P-P-E-R, apperception, or whatever that is. Talk about obscurity. There are key words here which no one has ever heard of in everyday Aussie world. You go down the shops. How's your apperception going? Oh, I'm doing some transcendental deduction. Okay, we're going to continue reading here. That's the general thing in transcendental deduction, which really is mind-blowing. But there's these categories here. I'm not quite sure how this all follows, but we are told this is incredibly complex, and I think the idea here is of incredible complexity. And I must admit, people must just go off their nut, getting, when they encounter complex people, they just would. I don't know how Kant would survive in Australian society. 4.1 Self-consciousness. One way to approach Kant's argument is to contrast his view of self-consciousness with the two alternative views that he rejects. Each of these views, both Kant's and those he rejects, can be seen as offering competing answers to the question, what is the sort of our sense of ongoing and invariable self that persists through all changes of our experiences? So what's the essence of us? And now, of course, we've got anesthetics and brain scans and dual personalities and brain dissections. We're getting a mechanical view of it, but this is getting it from the full rational viewpoint. Okay, oh my God. The first answer to this question that Kant rejects is that self-consciousness arises from some particular content being presented in each of one's representations. This material concept of self-consciousness, as we may call it, is loosely suggested by Locke's account of the personal identity. According to Locke, quote, it being the same consciousness that makes a man be himself to himself, personally, identity depends on that only, whether it be annexed only to one individual substance, capital S substance, or can be continued in succession of several substances. For a sort of a North Country feel from him. What Locke calls, quote, the same consciousness may be understood as some representational content that is always present in my experience, and that both identifies any experience as mine and gives me the sense of continuous self by virtue of its continual presence in my experience. One problem with this view, Kant believes, is there's no such essential content that is invariably present in experience, so the sense of ongoing self cannot possibly arise from the non-existent content, what Locke calls consciousness. Or Locke, I suppose. It depends if Locke, if you're a German pronunciation, they pronounce the E, and English wouldn't pronounce the Luke. Being present in each one's representations. In Kant's word, self-consciousness, quote, does not yet come about by my accompanying each of these representations with consciousness, but rather by my adding one representation to another and being conscious of their synthesis. Therefore, it's only because I can combine the manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it is possible for me to represent the identity of consciousness in these representations, end quote. Here Kant claims against the Lockean view that Self-consciousness arises from combining or synthesizing representations with one another regardless of their content. In short, Kant has a formal conception of self-consciousness rather than a material one. Since no particular content of my experience is invariable, self-consciousness must be derived from my experiences having an invariable form or structure, and consciousness of identity to myself through all my changing experiences must consist in awareness of the formal unity of a law-governing regularity of my experience. The continuous form of my experience is the necessary correlate for my sense of continuous self. Just going to stop here for a moment in terms of people who have a schism between the left hand and right hand brain, the actual sense of continuity and structuring a story. What's also is that people revise their previous stories to justify their present, so they revise their memory to justify what they're doing at the moment. So there's all these nuances in here that we sort of would dance do this from a neurological process, and look, then what we have actually done is we can electromagnetically by EM waves, this is amazing, we can put a magnet up to your head, vibrating magnet, and actually get you to have these various religious experiences. It's pretty amazing. There are at least two possible versions of the formal concept of self-consciousness, a realist and an idealist version. Oh my God, Father. On the realist version, nature itself is law-governed, and we become self-conscious by attending to its law-governed regularities, which also makes this an empiricist view of self-consciousness. The idea of an identical self that persists through all of our experiences on this view arises from the law-governed regularity of nature, and our representations exhibits other regularity because reality itself is ordered and regular. But Kant rejects this view and embraces a concept of self-consciousness that is both formal and idealist. According to Kant, a formal structure of our experience is unity and law-governed regularity, if an achievement of our cognitive faculties rather than a property of reality itself. I would tend to agree with that we tend to put in a structural law to our experiences. And when you ask people, you generally find out what their belief system is rather than what reality is. So self-consciousness for Kant consists in awareness of the mind's law-governed activity of synthesizing and combining sensible data to construct a unified experience. I would actually agree with Kant on this one. As he expresses it, quote, the unity of consciousness would be impossible if in the cognition of manifold in the mind could not become conscious of the identity of the function by the means of which the manifold is synthetically combined into one cognition. Well, I think a lot of people go through their life actually not thinking about their own thinking. That's my overall view. Oh, not really. I think a lot of people are aware of the way they think. Getting back to the next paragraph. Kant argues for this formal idealist conception of self-consciousness and against the formalist realist view on the grounds that, quote, we can represent nothing as combined in the object without having previously combined it ourselves, end quote. In other words, even if reality and itself were law-governed, the laws could not simply migrate over to our mind to imprint themselves on us while our mind is entirely passive. We must exercise an active capacity to represent the world as combined or ordered in a law-governed way, because otherwise we could not represent the world as a law-governed, even if it were law-governed in itself. Moreover, this capacity to represent the world as a law-governed must be a priori because it's a condition of self-consciousness, and we would already have to be self-conscious in order to learn from our experiences that are law-governed regularities of the world. So it's necessary for self-consciousness that we exercise an a priori capacity to represent the world as law-governed. But this would be also sufficient for self-consciousness if we could exercise our a priori capacity to represent the world as a law-governed, even if reality in itself were not governed. In that case, the realist empiricist concept of self-consciousness would be false, and the formal idealist view would be true. Well, Kant's confidence that no empiricist could account for the possibility could possibly explain self-consciousness may be based on the assumption that the sense of self each of us has, the thought of oneself as identically throughout all one's changing experiences, involved necessarily in universality, which, on his view, are hallmarks of the a priori. The assumption is reflected in what we may call Kant's principle of a perception. Quote, I think I must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is much as to say that the representation would either be impossible or else at least would be nothing for me. End quote. Wow, he's a tormented man. Notice the claims about necessity and universality embedded in the words must and all here. Kant is saying that for all representations to account as mine, it must necessarily be accessible to consciousness awareness in some, perhaps indirect way. I must be able to accompany it with, I think. All my representations must be accessible to consciousness in this way, but they need not actually be conscious, because, again, that is simply what makes representations account to mind. Self-consciousness for Kant, therefore, involves a priori knowledge about the necessary and universal truth expressed in this principle of a perception, and a priori knowledge cannot be based on the experience. Well, I'm going to have to really try to get my mind around what a perception is. I can't perceive what a perception is, but I sort of see where he's trying to go in this, but okay. Recently it has been argued that Kant developed this thread of his argument in Transcendental Deduction after reading John Nicholas Tetten's, whoever he was, rather than simply through a direct encounter with Locke's texts. On the subject of self-consciousness, Tetten's was a follower of Locke and engaged with Hume's arguments for rejecting and continuing self. So Kant's actual opponents in the deduction may have been Lockean and Humean positions as represented by Tetten's, as well as the rationalist view that Kant would have encountered directly in the text of Locke, Leibniz, Wolff, and some of their followers. Okay, so that's quite a big, heavy stuff to go. I really can't. Doing it, trying to basically, they're all struggling to explain consciousness without modern anesthetics and modern tests. My overall view is that children is consciousness slowly turns on, and there's one aspect that you become conscious gradually as you go through childhood. Your sense of self develops. We can do actual thoughts. We can actually see that the idea of yourself develops, the idea of people being separate self from you develops, so we can look at that. But also, I think there's, besides the individual growth aspect to it, there's a community sense of self. So, sense of self is actually not defined to one person, it's defined to a group. And so, what happens is you've got different people in the group at different journeys, and it's a group thing. That's my own personal tilt on this. And that will end this episode. I'm back to speak with you soon. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.